Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please find your way into the waterside room. Please take a moment to silence your mobile phones and devices.
Gloria, your mic's open. Stand by, VOG-1C. VOG-1C, go.
Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily.
Good morning, and welcome back. It's hard to believe that this is our last day together in Washington. The time has flown. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Margaret Low. I'm president of AtlanticLIVE, and with our wonderful partners at the Aspen Institute and Bloomberg Philanthropies, we are the team that brings you CityLab. I wanted to start the morning with a World Series joke. But I was told, without question, that baseball is no laughing matter. Thank you. I hope you're all having a magnificent time, that you've learned something new, been inspired by someone you've met, and that you're all going home with a notebook filled with big ideas. This is, as I look out here, this is an extraordinary group of people. You traveled here from 30 countries and 169 cities, from places like Atlanta, Topeka, Cheyenne, and San Juan, from Helsinki, Finland, Reykjavik, Iceland, Santiago, Chile, Quito, Ecuador, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. One city leader traveled farther than anyone else, more than 9,700 miles, 20+ hours of flying time by my estimate. Emil Dardak is the vice governor of East Java in Indonesia. I don't know if Emil is in the room, but nonetheless, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. If he's not, he's probably sleeping somewhere. Another shout out to Shada Al-Hashmi for being the city innovator who traveled more than 7,000 miles. Shada is the Director of Government Innovation for the United Arab Emirates. Here's to her. So many cities represented from so many different corners of the world, and yet with so many shared challenges and also opportunities. We have a packed morning ahead. We're going to hear about the power of protest and meet the mayor of San Juan, a city that finds itself in the middle of a movement for change. We'll look at what the 2020 census will mean for cities in this country, and we'll talk about the work being done right here in Washington and across the country to address the crisis in maternal health and to improve the well-being of mothers and babies. I do want to say that absolutely none of this would be possible without our underwriters, and I want to thank them. They are Amazon Web Services and Intel, Capital One, Exelon, General Motors, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and JBG Smith. Thank you all so much. Thanks to everyone here at the Intercontinental for taking such good care of us this week. Let's give a round of applause for the people who make this all possible. So now, let's get rolling. We're going to begin with a presentation on Ground Zero for Democracy, our city streets. For that, please welcome Austin Choi Fitzpatrick. He's a sociologist at the University of San Diego's Kroc School of Peace Studies and at the University of Nottingham. Take it away, Austin.
Thank you, Margaret. Appreciate it. Good morning. Protests are normal. Social movements, protests across the board move the needle economically, politically, socially. They move the needle in macro terms. They change the way we think about our consumption habits. On a regular basis, whether you turn on the TV or you turn to Twitter, social movements and protests, disruptive politics are making their voices heard. I prepped for this talk and I was getting ready to talk about Hong Kong, then I was going to talk about San Juan, two very important issues that we're going to hear more about in a little bit. And then I had to update my talk to talk about what? Barcelona, Santiago, Beirut, and before that, Gezi, Maidan, before that, Occupy Wall Street. And we'll hear more about San Juan today. Hong Kong is in all of our minds. Protests on a regular basis are changing the way we think about our lives, the way we think about our cities, and sometimes the way we think about ourselves. So I want to convince you today that protests are normal and that we should make place for them in our cities, more places and better places in them for our cities. This is a counterintuitive sort of argument because we often tend to think that politics is normal, it usually works. We all know what politics is, what normal politics are. I guess it's hard to imagine these days, but imagine what you used to think usual politics looked like and go back in your imagination. But you all are from cities, and so as it turns out, cities are better run units of government than some other forms of government, other units of government. And so you can congratulate yourselves on being part of units that work. But everywhere else, it turns out normal politics do a hit or miss job at identifying how to incorporate new voices, how to incorporate new ideas. Democracies are dynamic places with constant flows of new ideas, constant flows of new economic realities, new political realities, new people coming in the form of birth, new generations with new ideas, new people coming from other places in the form of immigration. And democracies sometimes struggle to find ways through the normal political process to adapt to these changes. That's one of the reasons I'm arguing that we see the sort of disruption on a daily basis that I mentioned earlier. This status quo, some status quo approach to politics and to transforming norms and values into public policy, struggles to keep up with these new calls for new rights, new recognition, new resources that draw on public spending, or sometimes the status quo actively blocks these calls, the sorts of calls that come from valued but ignored members of our community or members of the community that are intentionally ignored. So if the status quo doesn't always work in identifying these rights, demands for rights and recognition, then what do? I want to argue to you today that we need to work and do a better job at making cities that invite disruptive debates about what makes our democracies good, what makes our democracies worth fighting for, and how it is that we can work across very, very large differences to have difficult conversations, maybe before things get to the street, let's say. I started thinking about all of this on the streets in Budapest. I was documenting together with citizen journalists and a team of mine that uses drones to document events like this. We were documenting a protest against a tax on the internet in Budapest, €1 per gigabyte, not a lot of money, but it hit the rich and poor, young and old, pensioners and students, and everybody turned out onto the street to protest. The prime minister said it was the same old cranks and anarchists, and they were at it again. But people in the street knew what I knew there in the middle of that crowd, or seeing it from the sky, which is that it was everybody. Everybody had turned out. The people whose pocketbooks it hit had turned out on the streets, young and old, wealthy, not so wealthy, managers and owners of businesses, as well as employees and pensioners. So eventually, the protesters got what they wanted. The prime minister had to cave because we released footage like this that demonstrated it wasn't the same old cranks and anarchists. It was, in fact, everybody. So the protesters declared a victory. The prime minister took a hit. The policy was spiked. But I left this thinking, what is the actual role of protest size on public policy or on public perceptions of key events and key issues that we need to think differently about if we're going to have a dynamic democratic debate? So it turns out that this movement caught the attention of the international community, and they won. So turnout size matters, I decided. Now, you don't need me, a sociologist, to tell you that turnout size matters. This is something we know intuitively. It matters for politics, it matters for optics, and it matters for public policy. So if we're going to have, if turnout size matters, it turns out that good social science suggests that when you get 3.5% of the people onto the street non-violently, they're more likely to get what they are demanding than if they demonstrated violently or if they had much smaller turnout. So 3.5%, if you're community organizing in the room, 3.5% is the gold standard for turnouts for events like this. Now, as anybody who's ever organized communities can tell you, 3.5% is a small percentage, but it's a huge number of people, especially when you get to the level of cities. That protest in Budapest was 60,000 people. So that's 3.5% of the country's population. 60,000 people is a lot of people to mobilize. We're seeing much larger events in the cities that I had mentioned earlier, 300,000 people in some cases. million in others. We have estimates now coming out of anti-Brexit protests in London. Lots of people showing up. So 3.5% is this sort of gold standard. And it signals that people are serious, enough people, and enough different kinds of people are serious. It's not just one constituency. It's not just one group of claimants. When you get to 3.5%, it turns out it looks more like everybody. So this raises a new question. Where should we actually be having these sorts of protests? Now, traditionally, these sorts of protests have always happened in cities. Why? Fairly simple reason for this, I don't need to tell you. Cities have people, lots of the right kinds of people, students, activists, artists, a creative class, academics. They've got people coming from the countryside and consolidating in groups that are all of a sudden interest groups, or people coming from other countries and representing themselves in new ways as political votes, political blocs, and with economic pressure. So we've got the right people. We've also got communication channels in cities. Formal communication channels like television, newspapers, radio, social media, and informal mechanisms for spreading the word like word of mouth, posters, flyers, graffiti, asphalt art. We have other ways of spreading the word. And on top of this, there's a place to gather. There's a downtown, there's a plaza, there's some place that people know where to actually go. And if it's a capital city, the place people know to show up is in front of the halls of power. But I'm not just talking about capital cities or the halls of power. I'm talking about the 600 cities that saw a women's march last year, or the 1,000 cities that saw climate action this year. So I'm not just talking about capitals and halls of power. I'm talking about the cities that all of us call home. So the question is, if there is this kind of activity on the streets of the cities we all call home, how do we create new space for this sort of activity to emerge? We've gotten better and better over the last 20 years as city managers, I should say you all have, and mayors, and managing crowds and protests so they don't turn violent, innovated in ways that keep protesters sort of in special spaces where they can actually protest safely. These oftentimes are separate from the places they're actually the targets of their protest. So we've done better jobs with permitting, better jobs with essentially cordoning off protesters, but this separates important critique and important dynamic debates from actually ever spilling out into public. So we have better ways of permitting, but we need ways of thinking about, I don't want to say unpermitted space, about loose space. So it got me thinking about unassigned space. Where can we find spaces where people fill in with creativity, actual physical space? So it got me thinking about whether or not there's something we can learn from Burning Man. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer has started writing that maybe urban planners can learn something from the urban planning that happens at Burning Man. It's a flash city of 70,000 people where urban planners lay out the grid and the people fill it in. And all you need to do is Google Burning Man and take one scroll on Google and you'll see that people fill it in a lot of different ways. And that's not the urban planner's job. The urban planner's job is to lay the groundwork and do it in a way that's intelligent and people fill it in. The Free City of Christiania at the edge of Copenhagen, Denmark, is another space. It's an intentional anarchist community in which people who did not want to live under the repressive strictures of Copenhagen could be free. So I'm not saying that this is what marijuana's been legal for a long time. It's an autonomous collective. It's run collectively. It does not look like Copenhagen, and nor should it. And Copenhagen doesn't need to look like this place. The question is, do our cities have places, free places, open space places, where people can play at the edges of what freedom looks like, what democracy looks like, what new forms of identity look like, what it means to live together across great differences on purpose and constructively? And we should be making a place for this kind of thinking in our cities. And the reason for this is there are other ways to build cities. Louis XIV used the Great Fire of Paris as an excuse to widen the boulevards of Paris so they could be less easily blocked by barricades, the kind of barricades you may remember from Les Mis. Robert Moses, architect of the New York City, in many cases city planner for New York City that we kind of remember, that we think of, the iconic New York skyline and this sort of thing, had bridges into Manhattan built so that public transportation couldn't enter them, but private cars could, essentially putting a class barrier onto entrance into Manhattan from outer boroughs. The cobblestones on the streets of Hong Kong are superglued to the ground so they can't be dislodged and use as projectiles during protests. There are other ways to build and plan our cities that close off space to political debate, political discourse, and important conversations across huge differences. So how do we build cities that are safe for people, but also welcoming of deep and dynamic, vibrant, disruptive debate about what makes open societies that are fundamental for human flourishing? And what I want to leave you with is that protest is normal. It's happening in our cities already. We should make new and better space for it in our cities. And the reason this is important is that when people take to the streets, enough people take to the streets, after having not been listened to in the space that we've given them for long enough, and they take to the streets in sufficient numbers, they win. Thank you.
For the story of the San Juan protests, welcome the mayor of San Juan, Carmen Julene Cruz Soto, here with the host of NPR's All Things Considered, Mary Louise Kelly.
Welcome, Mayor. Good morning, everybody. We're going to stay right here with the theme of protests because your city, San Juan, was rocked by protests this summer. They started really small, a few hundred people, and then there were a few thousand people, and by the end of 2 weeks, there were hundreds of thousands of people.
1 million.
1 million?
1 million.
Which on an island of what,
2.9 million.
2.9 million, a third of the island was out on the streets. I want to begin with the why. It's hot in July in San Juan, and people have got stuff to do. Why did so many take to the streets at that moment?
Well, it was a perfect storm coming. We have been going through a recession for more than 10 years. We are a colony of the United States, so we have been imposed with a fiscal control board, 7 people that were not elected by the Puerto Rican people that decide anything. If an air conditioning gets put in a facility, if we have enough money to have rape kits looked at and be able to apprehend those that committed the crimes. So people were already really tired of austerity measures. And our pensions were being reduced. The cost of going to the University of Puerto Rico had tripled already. There's about, of the 11 campuses, 4 that are being looked at to be closed. Municipalities, there are 78 in cities in Puerto Rico. About 30 to 40 of them may not be able to open their doors, which means they won't be able to provide services. And then, of course, there was Irma and Maria, 2 devastating hurricanes that really, we were talking backstage. You have no phone, no electricity, no food, no water, no medication. And those that were supposed to come to your aid are they're more concerned about throwing paper towels at you than about being just and fair to you. So people were fed up already. Now, a chat in this application called telechat was leaked, 899 pages of the then governor with a few of his people from his administration, talking of women and referring to them as whores, ensuring that political opposition was being targeted. Things that you think happen in a dictatorship, they don't happen in a democracy. People
so
being
just
offered.
To catch us up, you're describing these conditions of inequalities and corruption and then the natural disaster that was Hurricane Maria. That was all in place. And then these text messages get leaked. The governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rosselló, who became the focus of the protests, was his messages, and they were targeting, among other people, you, and they were vicious.
Yeah, they were vicious. One of the ones where there's an investigation going, the representative of the government to the Fiscal Control Board said, I'm salivating, I can't wait to shoot her. And the governor replies, and you would be doing me a favor.
Yeah. I remember reading that.
But even worse than that, there was a mocking going on about the 3,000 people that died as a result of the botched effort of the federal government after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And you don't mess with the dead. You don't mess with the pain. You don't mess with what that means. And what was incredible is that people already knew that this is how this group of people were, but all of a sudden there was the evidence there raw, and no one denied it. Some of them apologized, but some of them said, no apologies are necessary.
So talk about your role. You're the mayor of San Juan. This is all unfolding in your city. You've got a job to do, but you decided to personally join the protests. How come?
Well, I've been a mayor. This is my second term. I was first a member of the House of Representatives at large in Puerto Rico. I was a member in a minority role. So what happens when you're in a minority role? And for those of you that have been in the legislature, these buildings have a way to dull your senses. So I made it very clear from the beginning that I was going to be amongst the people. And there was this piece of legislation called Law 7 that wanted to fire 30,000 governmental employees. There were a group of protesters outside, and they said they were wearing these orange T-shirts that said the big fish was eating the little fish, but the big fish was made of very tiny fishes. And they wouldn't let them go into the Capitol building of Puerto Rico because of the dress code. I mean, it's freedom of speech. You can wear whatever you want in a T-shirt. And I said, no worries. I'm a member of the House. I'll wear it. They'll have to let me in. Well, they didn't let me in. A really tense situation where there was pushing and shoving going on. And finally, I got in, and there was this whole discussion of should I be reprimanded as a member of the House for wearing a T-shirt that just said, if we join forces, we will be stronger. That's all it said.
If we join forces, we will be
stronger. So from there on, it became evident to me that these T-shirts that people wear during protest are an important billboard for what people want to say. And my job for the longest time was to go to a protest and hand out T-shirts. That was the way that I was painfully put aside by all of the protesters. But then they saw that it was genuine, that it was true. Not only did I join, but this is a protest that took place far from any political party. People of all political parties and ideologies joined forces in San Juan. So my job was to be, sometimes as a politician, you have to know when you have to be at the forefront, but you have to know when you have to be backstage. And what I did is three things. One is the central government asked me to look at the cameras of the municipality to really just, they said to make sure that everything was okay. And I knew they were going to use them to just go after people. So I said, no, you're not going to be using
these are security cameras.
Security cameras all over the city. Number two is we made City Hall a sanctuary. So anybody that received their head was cracked, because most of the protesters, you have 1 million people protest, or maybe 1 or 2 are not peaceful. But by and large, all of the protests were peaceful. By 11:45, the chief of police of the central government would say, this protest is now illegal. And they would simply take the law into their own hands, screw the Constitution, and, it is illegal. So they would start really hunting elderly people, children, because children went to protest with their mothers, men, women, it didn't matter. They would literally hunt them. And you have the scene, you can look at it on YouTube, where there's a whole bunch of policemen lined up, and they would literally look at somebody and go, phew, one by one.
Rubber bullets.
Rubber bullets, which still, when they're shot at close range, they still perforate your skin, and they don't. have as much damage as the other bullets, but they damage
What does
your
that
body.
mean when you say you made City Hall a sanctuary? I mean, were you bringing in medical personnel to treat people?
We had a trauma unit set up in City Hall, and we made it very clear to everybody that anyone that was running from police could come to City Hall, and we would not let the state police in. Now, I knew that I was running a risk and that I could have been taken to court, but the governor, coward that he was, did not take anybody to court. So that
How
was
did you do that? You had police, San Juan police guarding City Hall, keeping federal security forces?
San Juan police guarding City Hall, keeping the central government out. And people, as they ran in, we didn't go get them. As they ran in, they didn't dare. There's a thing that happens when, and we heard it before, Cesar Chavez said it, once social change has begun, it cannot be stopped. And once the protest begun and people were clear that this was a non-political grassroots movement, mainly fueled by the youth, mainly fueled by the use of technology, it was unstoppable. And the third thing that we did is we took the central government to court. That case is still open, to say, no, you cannot at 11:45 every night decide that a peaceful protest becomes illegal just to give you an excuse to go hunt people that are peacefully protesting. That case is still pending in the courts of Puerto Rico.
You raised something I want to follow on, but first I just want to flag, lest you doubt the mayor's commitment, not just to protest, but to protest T-shirts, which she raised. She sent us a couple of pictures, which I wonder if we can pull up on the screens. This is you, this is what, just this past weekend?
Last Sunday.
What's going on here?
That's last Sunday. Actually, I gave that hat to the mayor of Topeka, because she's Puerto Rican. I don't know if she's already here. But this was Fiscal Control Board calling for a second reduction in pensions, which will virtually pull almost half of our pensioners below the poverty level. And where are they going to come? They're going to come to their mayors to get money for their medication, to pay their mortgage, and so on.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have to be in the streets with people. You have to be listening to people. The entire city then becomes a platform. I often say that there are no voiceless people, that there are just people that don't have the appropriate platform. So I see City Hall and my role as providing that platform. Now, people have protested against me. And what have we done? We have made sure that policemen take care of them and protect them in terms of traffic so that nothing happens. We have water for protesters. We make sure that City Hall is open so people can use the bathrooms, even when they're protesting against the mayor. And, you know, it's a lot more important to ensure the viability of protests when people are protesting against you, because that shows that you're really a believer in democracy. I think protesting is the language of those that feel like they don't have any space, those that feel that they haven't been heard, those that feel that they have no other option but to get others to join in through a technological community. And we received all over the world reporters from all over the world, from radio and TV, which were a very important part of ensuring that grassroots movement have a platform and their platform is amplified. They're also a very good check and balance on police brutality, because it can be captured and then some of those videotapes can be used to protect people.
I want to share just one more picture that you shared with us. This speaks to the number of protests. This is your personal protest T-shirt collection?
That's at City Hall. I have another one at home. This is part of all the protests that I have been to since I've been a member of the House of Representatives.
So this is going back, what, a decade?
A decade, yeah, decade. Yeah. That's nice, because at home, the people from my party, I'm like, what the hell are you doing protesting us?
Well, and I mean, I think this message will resonate with this crowd, but I do want to ask, because this summer as the protests got bigger and bigger, and we're approaching 1 million people, as you noted, they morphed from general grievance and specific outrage about these text messages to a broad protest against the political establishment.
Yes.
Which you are very much part of.
Yes.
How did you navigate that?
I didn't. This was when you decide, look, times are changing. People are really considering democracy not as I go vote every 4 years, but I need a seat at the table. And I forget, somebody's going to tell me afterwards, it's, I think it was the first African-American to be elected to Congress said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. So people are bringing their folding chairs, and they're ensuring, how do we open the spaces of democracy? Little things that we have done at City Hall. One is for the municipal legislator, all of their hearings are given through the internet. They're shown in the internet. So people can know who goes only to vote and who goes to really take care of what is going on. We've done participatory budgeting.
Yeah.
I've never been much of an establishment politician. I've always been kind of an anti-establishment politician. So we did participatory budgeting, which we copied from New York City. Melissa Mark-Viverito was the Speaker of the House at the time. We're also in February beginning a youth municipal legislature where the youth will actually get a budget and they will be able to put forth legislation that will be approved by the legally endowed to do so legislature. So it's about incorporating different voices. We have a very large population of people that don't have the appropriate documents to live in San Juan and in a U.S. territory, and they're still part of the decision-making process on a day-to-day basis. But I understood this wasn't about me, this was about the grassroots movement, and all I could do was ensure that the platform was there for them to be in charge.
I appreciate your speaking frankly about the ongoing challenges, because I have one more question I want to put to you, and then we're going to open it. We're going to have time for a couple of your questions. But I asked, NPR has had a full-time correspondent in San Juan since Hurricane Maria, and I wrote to him and said I was going to interview you, and he was all excited and said, I've got a question for her. So I'm going to read you his question, and it's a tough one. He wrote, in San Juan, the city's infrastructure is crumbling. It's really, truly bad. Streetlights are out, leaving large sections of neighborhoods dark. The traffic signals don't work. The streets are in terrible shape, massive potholes everywhere, and notable incidences of violent crime recently, including a mass shooting that killed 6 people earlier this month. He wants me to put that to you and say, given that, given the state of affairs, given how much hasn't changed, do you see the protests from this summer as a moment, a movement? Did they fundamentally change your city?
No, they fundamentally change politics in Puerto Rico. Not only San Juan, but politics in Puerto Rico. The lines of political parties are now a little bit shady. The structures are important, but the movement within those structures are important. How willing those movements are in order to take over the old politics, the status quo politics. It changed. Irma and Maria changed us, and the summer of 2019 changed us forever. And people have every right to protest because that is true.
You don't disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree at all. I would add about 90,000 people are above the 60 years of age, which is very young. I'm 56, so I'm not going to knock down anybody that's 60 years of age. But about 45,000 of those live alone in their homes. About half of our population, 1.3 million Puerto Ricans need some sort of assistance to put food on the table every day. We still have 30,000 people living on the blue tarps, which is anything from 90,000 to 120,000 people that have to be taken out of harm's way. And what has happened is that the central government has put its financial strain and money onto the cities. And they don't have enough money to pay for pensions, so they divide what they cannot put into the pension fund amongst the 78 municipalities. And then we have to foot the bill. So it is a movement. It cannot be stopped. The issue is, how do we, as a government, as a municipal government, become the place where there is a platform for people to protest peacefully? How do we teach the next generation of protesting? In fact, we've been in communications with the Martin Luther King Center to take them to Puerto Rico, to San Juan, and teach anyone in the ages between 14 and 18 the 6 basic steps of civil disobedience and peaceful protesting. So how do we engage in creating a generation of people that understand that the power is in the streets? And how do they change a generation of politicians that think that power is theirs, but it truly isn't? I wrote a book, it's out of print, so I'm not selling it. In 2010, while I was a member of the legislature, called El Poder Está en la Calle, the power is in the streets. And it talked about the alliances that forge in the streets of people of common purposes and common goals, which usually, that's why those t-shirts are so important. You know, you can be and I want to give a shout out to the teachers in Chicago that are protesting right now, not only for better wages, but for better conditions for their students. And you can be, it doesn't matter what your ideology is, who you love, what your background is, you put on that t-shirt, and all of a sudden, you're wearing the same armor. You're fighting for the same things. And the status quo will want to divide us, will want to silence us, will want to make us look as radical. What is radical is children going to school without the materials that they need in order to break the cycle of violence and the cycle of poverty.
Questions from you all? We have microphones out there. Flag somebody down. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
I would like to ask what 3 policies do you think will be changed after the protest? Or how can you translate protest not only into politics, but also into policy on the municipal level?
Yeah, one thing would be, what is the role of the municipalities in a protest that is really beyond the municipality? And that is something that other mayors are starting to look at. In San Juan, we made sure that we understood that role before those protests, because we are the capital city of Puerto Rico. So a lot of the protests take place in a range that's less than a mile. We have our Congress, La Fortaleza, which is where the governor lives, the Department of State of Puerto Rico, and also City Hall. So it's a very dense place, politically speaking. That's number 2 is ensuring that the resources are there, because part of what happened is that people painted buildings in those protests. And one of the things the reporter said, we had to have crews cleaning up during the wee hours in the morning. The mayor was, you know, let's go, I'll go out with you and I'll clean up with you the streets. And we realized that because of the pepper spray, we could not clean up right after. Because as you're sweeping, or all of that comes right back up, and then your workers are also getting impacted by that. So we had started to clean up at between 4 and 6 in the morning. But you have to have also...
Those are lessons you never want to have to learn.
Never want to have to learn. No, yeah. Believe me, that's quite painful. But you have to also understand that this is a neighborhood. There are people living there. So right now, the municipality has put forward $1 million. It started as $500,000, but $1 million to paint all of the buildings. San Juan will be 500 years old in 2021. So there's a lot of history going on there. And also, how do you engage people in coming back and doing volunteer work to make sure that what has happened, people will cooperate in bringing it back to the way that it was? So those 3 things are important. The engagement for the volunteers, how do you set up the stage so that protests take place peacefully? And what I mentioned, how do you teach people to protest and not allow themselves to have people, I mean, look, we all know that there are people that go to these protests just to create unrest, because it is in their best interest that the message doesn't get through.
One more question.
Hi, good morning, Mayor. Roland Prasad with the Government Innovation Team at Bloomberg Philanthropies. I'd like to know whether you would like to see statehood status for Puerto Rico.
That's the $1 million question. No. But let me tell you what's most important, that what I would like to see. When you've invaded a country and you've put boots on the ground, this is not a civil rights issue. This is a self-determination issue. Now, mind you, while the federal government turned its back on us, we are very cognizant that the American people opened their hearts to us. And you fed us. And you gave us water. And you took care of our wounds. And when the federal administration could not find its way, you found your way. 320 AFL-CIO workers left their home 2 weeks after the hurricane, when the federal government was saying that it was unsurmountable, because we are an island surrounded by water, lots and lots of water, ocean water. That is a quote from the President of the United States. So while he is getting involved in this, the American people were leaving their homes to take care of us. And as a mayor, as a Puerto Rican, and as a human, I will forever be in your debt. Forever. Because you may not know it, but people were saved. 3,000 Puerto Ricans died. More could have died if it wasn't for the generosity of the diaspora, of the Latino population in the United States, and simply of the American people. So very briefly, what I think should happen is a process where all the voices are heard, those that want statehood, those that want independence, those that want enhanced commonwealth, and those that want free association, which is just like getting married with a prenup. And I've been married 5 times, I know about that. And at the beginning, I've enjoyed every marriage. It's that process that is important for all voices to be heard. That to me, politics is about voices, hearing people's voices, ensuring that they know they have a voice, and making sure that government is a platform for their voices to be heard.
Please thank me. Join me in thanking
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, welcome the chef of Kith and Kin and the author of Notes from a Young Black Chef, Kwame Onwuachi, here with Atlantic senior editor Ron Brownstein.
Good morning, everybody. You know, Chef, it is customary in these sorts of conversations to begin at the beginning, which seems logical enough. How did you get interested in cooking? What are the influences that just shaped your cooking? I actually want to begin in the middle. Okay. Because there is one particular moment in this very engaging book of yours, memoir, by the way, which made me hungry on almost every page, reading it and your description of your recipes and your mom's recipes. But there's one moment in the middle where you're working at 11 Madison Park, which is one of the finest, dining restaurants in America, and a friend of yours comes to you and says, I want you to cater a dinner with Senegalese food. Mm-hmm. And you say, oh, it doesn't feel quite right. And he says, well, do you want to do like Nigerian food? Mm-hmm. And you go, well, that doesn't feel quite right. And so finally he says, what does feel right? Mm-hmm. And you answer,
my story.
Your story.
Yeah, my story feels right.
Yeah.
I think as young chefs, we're always trying to find our voice in this industry, and especially a chef that is a minority. I also come from, my family's from Nigeria, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Louisiana. It's unfair to just choose one of those places when I was so young and coming up, that I wanted to tell it all, and see how I could find my voice in that experience.
Yeah, because you say, I want to cook my own food. I'm Nigerian, I'm America. I grew up on Creole and Jamaican food. I've been working in fine dining now for a long time. And then you say, I want to cook whatever that is.
Yeah.
Right?
So the thing is, whenever you open a new restaurant, the press always comes, they're like, so what classification of food is this? And it's like, it's good food. I don't know. Like, I want to do whatever I want to do, you know? And it was funny when I opened this restaurant, I was like, I'm doing Afro-Caribbean food. They're like, what is that? Mm-hmm. And I didn't really have an answer for where they can go and get that specifically. But, you know, the lineage of Afro-Caribbean, you know, by definition is someone that comes from the Caribbean that has African descent. And I think you can't begin to talk about American cuisine without talking about West African cuisine and how that's influenced America and the Caribbean and beyond.
Well, that's, you know, so I'm not a food writer, I'm a political writer, and I've spent most of the last quarter century writing about how Americans are adapting or not to demographic change, cultural change, economic change. And I really thought about that answer. I want to cook whatever that is, because it seems to me that really gets at a bigger question. As you said, you know, we are a world nation. We are an amalgamation of a lot of different influences. I live in LA now. Roy Choi, who is one of our became famous for the Korean taco, you know, he said, I think my cooking tastes like what America is becoming. Is that the way you feel?
I think it's the way America has always been. Now there's Instagram, you get to see it all the time, you know? So like, I think America has always been influenced by immigrants, or I wouldn't even say immigrant, just a collection of cultures. You know, if you think of the original indigenous American food, it was a marriage between, you know, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. They taught them the 7 sweets and 7 sours, which we still eat today, which are pickles and cranberry sauce. And, you know, the Native Americans taught them the act of preservation, which is smoking. We eat smoked salmon every morning in most places. So it's always been there. But now we have social media just to see it, and it's in our face all the time.
Yeah, there's definitely an audience, right? There are people who want to be exposed to these new combinations, these kind of new flavors, literally, that is making up what America, you know, always has been, and is perhaps becoming even and more so. On the other hand, there is an America that will chant "Send them back" at a rally about, you know, 4 Democratic women of color in the House.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Which one do you think is closer to the essence of what America is at this point?
I think they're both the essence of America, unfortunately. I mean, when the First Amendment was written, I don't think they were talking about all Americans, but that was a huge amount of Americans that were not represented in that. But, you know, there's a lot of Americans that do feel that way. And once again, social media and the media in general is just showing what America really is. And it's really unfortunate to see that.
I mean, because let's say the paradox is there are people right below us or right next to us, I don't even know what floor we're on, who will line up for Afro-Caribbean food or for this new fusion.
Did you all eat downstairs by any chance? Has anyone been to Kith and Kin?
Yeah.
Yeah? Awesome. So we need to go on TripAdvisor and give us a review. Okay, we need 100 reviews. So I want everybody to say "I promise" on 3. 1, 2, 3. Now don't you lie now, okay?
Do you find that, you know, kind of your audience, your consumers, do they want the new experience?
Yeah.
How much experimentation do they want?
So it's funny, right? I'll lead this by like when a lot of people are like, how did you come up with the inspiration for this fusion? It is amazing. I'm like, this is Thanksgiving to me. I'm just putting it on a menu and people are thinking it's innovative. But it's Thanksgiving. I mean, we would bring food together, all of our different cultures. We'd have oxtail and we'd have jollof rice and we'd have gumbo, we'd have curry goat, and it was awesome. Yeah. So I think what Kith and Kin really allows people to do, so it's 2 sets of people. One is people that have been inaudible in this industry, like they have not had a voice because there hasn't been a place where they can celebrate their culture while celebrating a special experience. And let me break that down. Yeah. You can't go anywhere and get a really good plate of oxtails or curried goat or jerk chicken and also get a crafted cocktail to go with that, and some to like pair a wine with that, right? But you can do that with Italian food. You can do it with, you know, French food or even American food. So it's giving people a chance to celebrate their culture while celebrating a special experience, and that's what I love about Kith and Kin. But also, it gives a group of people that have no idea what this food is, and it gives them an environment where they can get the information they need to really absorb it. Because on a plate of food, you can cross nations, you can cross cultures. And it's the only true art form that you actually ingest.
Yeah, so, yeah, you talk about how much information is really encoded in food or embedded in food in terms of cultural understanding. Now, when we're talking about resistance to change, certainly the high end of the restaurant industry can face that criticism as well. I mean, there's been a lot of scrutiny of it in the aftermath of Me Too. But you talk about kind of the role of race in your experiences really at every turn in the industry. High-end cooking still the province of white men mostly?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Not gonna sugarcoat it.
Yeah. Why?
Well, I think there's a multitude
especially
of
given
reasons.
the world nature, the world nature of the cuisine.
So there's multiple reasons, right? We've worked so hard to get out of kitchens, and now we're fighting to get back into kitchens. People of color and women, right? So like, that's like the comedic relief of it all. But really, it's not a comfortable environment for us. I would say the kitchen is much as absolved from sexism as it is racism, because you can mask racist remarks under the hazing, or you got to go through this, or when I was coming up, this happened to me. But you can tell the stark contrast. It may not be as easy as someone slipping the N-word, because people aren't that stupid anymore. But it can be the constant overlooking, the constant passing up, the subtle racist jokes.
Well, you described Per Se, 11 Madison Park, two of the highest rated restaurants in the country, but a pretty rough environment in each case.
Yeah.
And did you, on the other hand, it's kind of you're talking about the capacity of food to be a bridge. One of the most interesting sections for me in the book is when you're describing working on these cleanup ships in the Gulf with. So maybe explain the story. You're working on ships that were basically deployed to the Gulf after the Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah, you all heard about that little oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico?
Yeah.
So the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, they were paying, I'm going to be honest, a lot of money for people to go out there and risk their lives. So I signed up. And when I got out there, I was terrified. One, because you open your eyes and all you see is a sea of black everywhere on top of the ocean. But two, I was the only person of color, again, on this cleanup boat. But we had more similarities than we had differences, because these, older white guys had come from backwoods Louisiana. So when I was cooking, I mean, the first question I got on the boat was, the chef asked me, do you know how to read? Because I have a lot of people like you that come on here that can't read. And I was like, this conversation is over. So you know what? You cook your food. I'm not your sous chef anymore, because I got 3 weeks before the helicopter comes back to get me. So I'm gonna cook my food, you cook your food, and let's just see how that goes. I probably will never be invited on this boat again, but I'm not gonna listen to someone that doesn't think I can read for some strange reason.
Yeah. The guys like the food.
They like the food.
Now, if you would have met them in other circumstances, you probably wouldn't have been palling around.
I may not have cooked for them if I didn't get that opportunity. So I didn't have any recipe books. I didn't plan to cook everything on my own, but I just cooked things that my mom taught me growing up, which was gumbo and shrimp étouffée and red beans and rice. And it were things that they grew up eating, so we bonded over that plate of food.
And you were able to make that connection. Yeah. Now, you talk about in the book toward the end, you say you want to create a restaurant that reflects the diversity of America in every way, in what it cooks and who is doing the cooking, who works there, and who is sitting at the table, kind of the totality of the experience. Do you feel like you've achieved that at Kifkin?
I'm still striving for it. I think it is, it's the most diverse restaurant I've ever worked at. So, my pastry chef is Dominican. My executive, my CDC is from Greece. My executive sous chef is, a black guy from Philly. We have so many different cultures represented, and it's not really about me skimming through resumes. Like, does this sound like a black person? Like, it's not, I think that's illegal anyway. But I think people just gravitate, like women of color, people from all different nationalities gravitate towards here because it is a melting pot.
How about the clientele?
The clientele is a rainbow. It's awesome.
It is.
Whenever
so you're happy with that?
Yeah. Whenever I get really stressed out, because it's hard to work in a restaurant that's open 24/7, I walk around the dining room and I really get inspired when there's a Nigerian table teaching some white people how to eat fufu and stew with their hands, and they're all it's just it's like a party in the dining room every night, and I get to be the host of that. And you get to teach people different food ways, as well as give people a platform to celebrate. Yeah,
it's really interesting. It feels to me, as I was listening to you describe that is the fundamental political divide in America today, between those who hear what you just said and say, wow, that is great. That is the opportunity that we have as we become this even more of a world nation, integrating cultures from all over the world, and those who kind of look at what you just described and say, hey, that's not the America I grew up in. That's, you know, that is a threat to me and everything that I represent. I mean, that really is the divide. It's almost like whether you know, where your restaurant would be welcomed.
Well, I would encourage those people that say that to come and eat some curry goat and see if they have the same things to say about immigrants.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning, because you grew up in the Bronx, financially struggling family. You know, had issues in high school and in college. At one point, you were selling candy on the subway to fund your business.
Candy.
Candy.
No,
candy. Literally candy.
It was candy. It was candy.
It was candy. You were selling candy in college, but on the
yeah.
subway, you were selling candy.
I downgraded.
Yeah, you downshifted at least.
Yeah. A lot more safe.
Talk a little bit about where your interest in cooking began and what made you stick with it through all of these.
So my mom was a chef, and she wanted to figure a way how to raise us while keeping the lights on and not have babysitters raise us, which is easy to happen in New York City. So she started a catering company out of the house in our one-bedroom apartment. And probably against the law, me and my sister became her first 2 employees. I was 5 years old, my sister was 10, and I learned a lot of like basic French techniques because that is the basis of Louisiana cooking at a very young age, and I really got addicted to it.
Yeah, your mother was a powerful presence in your story. She believed in some tough love. She sent you to Africa at one point.
Yeah, against my will. So you want to clap it up for her?
Give people a quick sense.
Best mom of the world.
Yeah, give people a quick sense of that story.
No, she did a great thing for me. She changed my life completely and gave me life. I was veering off on the wrong path, which is pretty easy to do in the South Bronx, and she told me I was going on a 2-week trip to Nigeria to visit my grandparents in 2 months, and I called her and I was like, hey, Mom, school's starting. Like, summer vacation is up. I got to get back. And she's like, you're not coming home until you learn respect. So she left me there for 2 years. And I learned a lot. You know, I learned to really care about, I wasn't in Lagos in Nigeria. I was in like a small village, Ibusa. And I was able to learn what it really takes to create a meal. Like raising chickens, raising goats, cultivating vegetables. If I wanted a 20-piece bucket of fried chicken wings, I needed to raise 10 chickens. It would take like 5 months. So like, there was a real...
And yet, by the time you left, you were reluctant to leave.
Yeah, that's what I said to her, but I really want to come back.
You want to come back?
I had to act like I had respect
right.
over the phone.
Yeah, it didn't necessarily go that differently once you got back, right?
No, it became home. You know, I was able to we didn't have electricity or running water. There was no like PlayStation or like Nickelodeon. I was able to really use my imagination and thrive in it. And I think that's what has become a huge asset for me to this day.
Yeah, you know, you describe at one point, you say in the story, in the book, my ability to slide through 2 different worlds was my greatest asset in those years. Still true?
Now I just do whatever I want, so it's a little bit better. But I think coming up as like, even a person of color, you have to know how much of yourself to reveal to the world, because there are people that are chanting, send them back, and those people sometimes, unfortunately, are at the top. So you have to mask who you are. I got a Malcolm X hat on right now, so like I'm not masking myself anymore.
Great, let's bring in the audience for a couple questions. You're gonna have to pick them because I can't see them in the light. Questions? Let me ask you one while we're finding a question. You know, you grew up in the South Bronx, I grew up in Queens. There are a lot of neighborhoods in places like the Bronx and Queens and certainly Brooklyn that are a lot different than they were when you were growing up or when I was growing up before that in the 70s in New York. And there are a lot of young people with money who are now willing to live in cities who were not willing to live there before. And that's why all of these condos on these few blocks around us, they couldn't have existed 20 years ago because by the time anybody had that much money, they were going to hightail it out of the city. And a luxury, a high-end restaurant on 9th and Q, is that where you were? 9th and Q? I mean, that would not have been possible when I first moved to DC. Or even this right here. Is this a good thing or a bad thing in the life of cities?
It's a double-edged sword. I mean, it reduces crime rate and people getting hurt. But also it forces a group of people out that have been here, the good ones that have been here for a long period of time. So I feel it's a double-edged sword because when gentrification started happening in my neighborhood, I was like, thank you. like, because I didn't get beat up on Halloween anymore, or like, you know, I didn't have to worry about walking home, but at the same time, it was pushing a group of people out. So I have a, it's kind of it's not an easy answer to that question for me, because I've lived in these areas as it was happening.
Right, and as you say, there's a positive side, but there is a displacement issue, and I think cities everywhere are struggling. You know, like I said, in the 90s in the Bronx, the problem was not too many people trying to move in.
Yeah,
right. I mean, that was not the problem. Or in the 70s in Queens when I grew up, it wasn't like people were rushing in, and it was like, oh my God, how are we going to keep housing costs affordable? It was more like, how are we going to preserve, you know, what we have? And now you have the reverse. I mean, you know, cities are dealing with, in some ways, a problem of success, but there's a real cost to existing neighborhoods. When you kind of look around DC as kind of your adopted, you know, hometown, how does it compare to New York in the way that it is segregated economically, culturally, racially?
I would say, oh man, that's tough. I would say it's worse. There's a huge segregation in here. I don't know any of my friends that have ever been to Anacostia, which is across the bridge where all of the people of color live. So the segregation is huge here. And there are definitely some affluent people of color that can afford to live in Shaw and the Navy Yard and the Wharf, but you know, majority of the people of color, it's still Chocolate City for them.
Yeah. Let's go over here. There's a question.
Hi, my name is Jessica Nigro. I'm a longtime DC resident. I'm just wondering what has surprised you about the DC food scene, and if you have some female chefs, not necessarily only in DC, who you really would like to work with or respect.
What surprised me was the diversity of the extremely cultural food in DC. I'm talking El Salvadoria, I'm talking Ethiopia. That really shocked me, and how authentic it is. Female chefs that I admire, Karen Akunowitz in Boston, Daniela at Timber and Call Your Mother Deli, Chef Faulkner, she lives in New York City, May Lynn at Los Angeles, Naisha Arrington in LA, Nina Compton in New Orleans, Mashama Bailey at The Gray in Savannah. There's so many women chefs that are amazing and doing really dope things. So I'm excited about that.
Can I ask you real quick before we go? You got to cook one meal. Your immortal soul is at stake. All right, this is like, you know, what's on the menu?
Gumbo.
Gumbo.
Easy. My moral soul is broken. That heals me.
All right, good. Good to know. We will be back.
All right,
thank you.
All right,
For a session produced by our underwriter, Exelon, please welcome Dave Velasquez, the president and CEO of Pepco Holdings, here with Gilbert Campbell, the co-founder and managing partner of Volt Energy.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Dave. Good to see you.
Good morning. I'm Gilbert Campbell, co-founder of Volt Energy. We're a solar energy development firm based here in Washington, D.C., but we do projects nationwide with large companies like the Cheesecake Factory. We did solar at City Hall here in D.C., and we're doing a project at Howard University now. But it's my pleasure to sit with you today and participate in this event with great minds from cities all over this country who are all focused on the same goal, making our cities cleaner and more vital. It is my honor to talk with my friend today, Dave Velasquez, President and CEO of Pepco Holdings, an Exelon company. In addition to local energy companies, Atlantic City Electric in New Jersey and Delmarva Power in Delaware and Northern Maryland, Pepco Holdings delivers electricity right here in our nation's capital. In fact, Dave is keeping the lights on in this very room. Minus a little bit of gray, it's a beautiful day today, but Dave certainly has a perspective on what it takes to keep the lights on when we're experiencing severe weather. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Thank you and welcome, Dave. Thank you. So Dave, my first question, I need you to think this through. It's a very difficult question. So we both hail from the city of Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. So in a few weeks, the Philadelphia Eagles play the Washington Redskins. How bad are we going to beat them?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. It is a city of brotherly love, though. So actually, as an Eagles fan, if you follow football, I'm much more worried about the Bears next week, the way we've been playing, than looking forward to December as well. But But again, Gilbert, it's great to be sitting here with you and to enjoy a partnership with you as well, and a number of things that we've been able to do together. And as you've said, it's great to be with this group. When I think about the variety, the diversity of experiences that are represented in this audience, what a great way for us to be able to learn about what we need to do. Because just like I think cities across the country, we've been in business here at Pepco for probably 125 years. I've been in this business for almost 40 years. And I think just like the cities across the country, we're undergoing fundamental, transformative change. And we need to be stepping forward and seeing what we can do as a local utility company, an important part of the community, to be able to help drive forward what we can to help combat climate change as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Dave, that's certainly a huge undertaking. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the ways that Pepco and Exelon is working to combat climate change?
Sure. So first, let me say climate change is real. We're already seeing the effects of it, both, I'll say, in storms that we see, the intensity of those storms, the frequency of those storms. Just as much impact on us, though, is the extremes of weather. So our sister utility in Chicago this winter, if you were following the news, negative 20, negative 30 degree temperatures. That's not normal. Here in the district this summer, in the month of July, and I think I'll get it right, there were 27 days in the month of July when it was over 90 degrees here. That is not normal either. All that has real impacts on our system. So when you think about what we're doing, we're investing in new technology, both to help make the system more resilient. So when storms come, we're creating with information and automated switches, kind of a self-healing network. In addition to that, we're using technology, whether it's battery storage or other means, to allow more and more renewable energy resources, solar, to be hooked up to folks' homes. We have between our utility here and in Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey, we have over 70,000 customers today that are generating electricity from solar generation. We're also doing our bit to support, I'll say, decarbonization policies. Here in the district, they passed, I'll say, rather groundbreaking legislation at the end of 2018, beginning of this year, to drive towards 100% renewable energy by 2032. All the, I'll say, rideshare buses, major employers' vehicle fleets by 2045 have to be zero emission. So very supportive of driving ourselves there. In New Jersey, there was the Clean Energy Act that we supported that also is driving that. And I'll just make two comments on that. One is that's not something that we can do alone. I don't think it's something that any of us can do alone. I think the partnerships that we have collectively to help drive that forward are so important. It's something collectively, it's an issue we face collectively, it's an issue we need to address collectively. It's also an issue that I think we need to be very conscious of making sure that we do it in an equitable fashion. So there's many, as we think about deploying new technology, all this requires investments. We think about additional solar, additional renewable energy on the grid. All this requires an investment, and we need to make sure we do it in a way that is affordable for all our customers. We also need to make sure we do it in a way to make sure that it is available to all our customers. For instance, here in the district, we're beginning to roll out, as a utility, the infrastructure to support electric vehicle charging. That's not something we're just doing downtown DC, but it's something we want to make sure is spread across all wards of the city, across all parts of the city, that everyone can take advantage of that. So that equity issue, I think, is one that's going to continue to be in the forefront.
Absolutely. Well, you've shared some. I know you're working on multiple projects right here in the district that are changing the way residents think about energy consumption and go about their daily activities. Can you just elaborate on a few more projects?
Sure. So in DC, I mentioned electrification of the transportation system. About 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the district come from vehicles. Again, the energy that buildings, homeowners, businesses consume, whether it's electricity or natural gas, also contribute a large portion of that. So what we're doing, and what the district has been doing to push for 100% renewable energy, is going to help drive that. What we're doing to help support an electric vehicle charging infrastructure is going to help the city achieve those goals as well. I'd mentioned we continue to put in new processes, better processes, to allow customers to more quickly install renewable energy, or solar, for instance, which is the primary renewable energy here in the district. But I also talked a little bit about resiliency, which is also important. We have a program in a private-public partnership with the city that was announced a couple years ago, and it's now underway, called DC Plug Powerline Undergrounding, to take the most vulnerable lines we have, and again, with a co-investment with the city, public-private partnership, to put a lot of those most vulnerable lines underground. We've also thought about our vulnerable population, and we made a grant last year to Jubilee Housing, which invests in the city in affordable housing. They have a new affordable apartment complex they're building called Maycroft, and they were going to put solar, which they did, put solar panels on the roof, and we gave them a grant in addition to that to install batteries in the facility as well. The thought being, these are some of our more vulnerable residents, and this power, the batteries will help provide power for 3 days in the event that there's an outage. So when you think about, needing to be able to have communications, be able to charge your cell phone, be able to watch TV, but also to have refrigeration for medicines and things like that, all those essential things. Again, an investment, we're trying to find innovative ways to kind of help provide our customers with a way of being able to withstand the impacts that climate change is bringing.
Mm-hmm. So as a residential customer living here in the district, and also as a business owner, I'm encouraged to hear and proud to be a Pepco subscriber and all the work that you're doing behind the scenes to make the city cleaner. And I just want to share a quick personal story that speaks to Dave's leadership. You may not even remember, but it's about 6 years ago when, about 3 years into the company, Dave reached out to me and said, I'd like to have breakfast with you and just learn a little bit more about your company, how I can be supportive. And as a young CEO, to have the CEO of our local utility company do that meant the world. So Dave, I really appreciate that. And that speaks volumes to Dave's character, but also to Pepco Holdings and Exelon's commitment to both not only supply diversity and growing small business, but just growing future leaders. So Dave, I want to thank you, Pepco Holdings and Exelon, for your continued commitment to creating a clean energy future in the district and beyond. It was my pleasure to talk with you today.
So if I could just make a comment before about that. We have defined our purpose as powering a cleaner and brighter future for our customers and communities, and that was a very deliberate choice of words around cleaner and brighter. And Gilbert hit on a point that we haven't touched on yet. We've been here for 125 years. I remind people of that occasionally. With that comes a very, very deep roots that we have in the community. And when we think about what impact we can have on the community, we take very seriously the fact that it goes beyond just what we can do, if you will, to keep the lights on. But it's what are we doing to invest in local businesses. Given a choice, 100% of the time, I would rather buy local than from someplace that's not local. We need to invest in our communities. I talked about our partnership with the mayor and the city. We also opened this year, along in partnership with the mayor, DC Infrastructure Academy, where we're training local residents to be able to get good jobs with us and our contractors as well. And the last thing I wanted to say was our parent company, Exelon, probably about a month ago, announced a climate change investment initiative. It's a $20 million investment that the corporation is making in all the major cities we serve: Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Atlantic City, Wilmington, Chicago, for local startups that have innovative ideas to help combat climate change. So it's a local investment, local companies that are driving climate change initiatives in innovative ways. And the thought here is, again, to help spur that moving forward, but then also to make sure the investment stays local. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk and also to listen as the day goes on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stand by DOG 6 go.
For a conversation on the 2020 census, please welcome the Mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, Jorge Elorza, and Terry Ann Lowenthal from the Funders Census Initiative. They are here with Atlantic staff writer Derek Thompson.
Hello, good morning. So $1 trillion in federal funding, congressional representation, and emergency planning across the country in a time of catastrophic climate change. These are just three of the many, many components of the US Census, and one of the three of the reasons why it's such a critical issue for this country. I want to start with you, Terry. This is a really smart audience that I think will understand much better than most that you speak to just why the census is so critical and so foundational. But give us a full sense of why it is such an important civic project.
Well, thank you, Derek. And by the way, I do want to thank the sponsors because for recognizing the import of this issue to cities. I see Bloomberg Philanthropies census warrior Rose Gilhern here. So thank you. She's been working with cities across the country to mobilize. But as you said, the census is foundational, and it is a guide star, I think, for so much of what we do in this country. It is the foundation of our democracy and the promise of equal representation through apportionment and redistricting, not just in Congress, but in state legislatures, city councils, school boards. As you said, it guides more than $1 trillion, but that's every year, directly or indirectly, to cities, states, and households. And it is again, the guide star for planning and prudent investment of resources, both by government, but also by the private sector, by businesses.
Mayor, give us a sense, this is a beautiful explanation of why census matters at a 10,000-foot level. On the ground in Providence, give us a sense of how you find census data to be absolutely critical to the maintenance and functioning of your city.
Sure. Thank you, Derek. And I also want to thank all of the sponsors for prioritizing this and giving us a platform to talk about it, to help get the message out. So it's critical to the work that we do in our cities. And a lot has been said about the lack of federal leadership and partnership to cities over the past several years. But we still, nonetheless, rely on strong federal partners. And whether it's federal formula dollars, such as Title II, or CDBG dollars, we're facing significant, severe challenges in our cities, and we need to marshal all of the resources that we have. So if we're concerned about the education that our kids are getting and whether they're being prepared for the challenges of the future, that's how we use our Title II dollars with education. So we can bridge the gap between the rich and poor and make sure that our kids are receiving top-notch education. We rely on these funds. But it's also things such as addressing the homelessness challenge, whether it's home funds, CDBG funds. These are the dollars that we put on the streets to create new units of housing to make sure we get folks off the street and into supportive and stable housing. Essentially, everything that we work on and everything that we do at the city level, we rely on our partners at the federal level. And for all of these reasons, it's important that we get this complete count right and make sure everyone gets counted so we commit the resources that are required to face these really significant challenges.
Yeah, the project of counting 330 million people, 340-some million people, it is a Herculean challenge. Like, as an individual sitting at my desk writing about the news, it is almost impossible for me to imagine how this is accomplished. And the fact is that it's not always accomplished perfectly. There is a historical disproportionate undercount of urban populations, of rural poor populations, even, as you said backstage, of young children in America. Terry, give us a sense of why it's so difficult to count properly in some places and count properly within some populations, and how we can start to think about getting smarter about this.
Yes, so you're right. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that I think the Census Bureau does the best it can with the resources it is given. Yeah. And it is made up primarily of professional civil servants. But the census is not an equal opportunity enumeration. It does not count all communities, all population groups equally well. And so historically, it has missed disproportionate numbers of people of color, as you said, of young children, especially Black and Latino children.
You're getting some intervention. There you go. Thank you very much.
Technology. Black and Latino children and low-income households and so forth. There are a number of challenges. Every census has its challenges. Every census has its controversies. I am particularly worried that the 2020 census is facing a set of unprecedented challenges that could thwart the success of this census. I mean, let me just tick them off very quickly at a very high level. I mean, the Census Bureau has not had sufficient or timely resources for much of this decade. This is the first high-tech census. We all agree we have to modernize the process, but technology brings risks, real and perceived. I often say, Russia, we hope you're not listening. And a subset of that, of course, is a major challenge. I think cities have to be vigilant about this, disinformation campaigns that will affect not just the election, but the census as well. There is a climate of fear, that started before the last presidential election. It drove millions of people into the shadows. That was before the citizenship question controversy. I'm worried about natural disasters. I call it climate change meets the census. And I think lastly, we have to just remember, this census is going to be conducted in the cacophony of what's going to be probably a very nasty, I can't think of a better word, presidential campaign. And the Census Bureau has to be heard to get its message out above that noise, and that's going to be difficult.
Mayor, cities face an acute challenge when it comes to getting an accurate count for a couple reasons, it seems to me. On the one hand, you have the fact of a historical disproportionate undercount of urban populations. Number two, we're talking at a moment when immigration and immigration status is really it's high in people's minds when thinking about, are people going to feel comfortable sharing information about their life with a government that they might not trust? And then finally, you have the homelessness crisis that's striking so many cities, and I feel like counting the homeless population must be a challenge on top of these other urban challenges. So give us a sense of your roadmap to making sure that your city gets a proper count next year.
Sure. It truly is discouraging that politics has infested every aspect of our lives, and the same is true of the census today. So logistically, it's a massive challenge every 10 years, as it is, and this is just an additional hurdle that's been added to it. So, of course, we're concerned about an undercount, but we're even more concerned about a disproportionate undercount of not just urban communities, but certain hard-to-reach communities vis-a-vis suburban and even rural communities. And it really falls on us at the local level, at the city level, at the state level to make sure that we're getting out there. And by this point, every city and state should have their own complete count committee. We should think about this as a campaign. As politicians, we've all run campaigns in the past. We know how to do them. Everything from lawn signs to stickers to go on the radio. I mean, at this point, those are the basics, and we should all be preparing to do that. But it's also important to remember that a top-down approach has its limitations. And when we're talking about hard-to-reach communities, there are communities that are extremely difficult for us to reach, but they're less extremely difficult for other community partners to reach. And so remember that you're not alone in this. We have a lot of willing and able community partners, and they need to be leveraged very smartly to make sure that they're amplifying the message and getting out there, touching people so that they feel comfortable filling it out. Another piece to this is that, yes, the results of this are extremely important for our future, and people get that. People understand that. So if residents are hearing that sufficiently from people that they trust, sometimes from politicians, sometimes not from politicians, I'm optimistic that that message will resonate and we can get folks to fill it out. As we mentioned, we did a full end-to-end test run in Providence. It wasn't fully funded, so we can't truly applaud the results of it. But there are at least two phases of the census count. The first one is where we mail it out and ask people to self-report. As Terry Ann mentioned, this is the first year that we're strongly encouraging folks to fill it out online. And what was encouraging about the test run was that our self-response rate was about what it's been in the past in this first phase of it. So that's definitely encouraging. But then when we move to the second phase where people didn't fill it out on their own and we have to send the census workers to knock on doors and to urge people to fill it out, we haven't received the full results of that yet. And that's where I believe that the difficulty of reaching these communities is going to rely on every bit of goodwill that we as politicians or you as community leaders have built up over time to continue to spread the message that, yes, in spite of all the fear and danger that's out there, it is safe to fill this out. You don't have to be concerned. And that's on top of, yes, the homeless community, children, documented and undocumented immigrants. It's already difficult to reach, so we have to employ every strategy in the book.
Right. We now have all used the word fear in discussing the 2020 census, so I think it's worth being specific about the elephant in the room, which I believe is the citizenship question that the Trump administration wanted to put into the census. Terry Ann, can you just walk us through, give us a kind of cliff notes of what that process was, what the citizenship question was, why the administration wanted to put it in the census, and then how it fared in the legal process?
Sure. Well, we do have to do cliff notes because, as you probably have read, this had a long and sordid history.
Saga.
A saga it is, and I can write a book after I retire. It turns out the administration was sort of cooking up the idea of a citizenship question, and its allies were long before the current president was ever announced that he was running for office. But having said that, a year into this administration, out of the blue, the administration announced that it wanted the Census Bureau to add what we believe was an untested, well, it was untested, but it was also unnecessary question asking about citizenship. This is after the content, the questions on the form, had been locked down in accordance with a timetable set forth in law. And so, sort of chaos ensued. This really took a process that should have been at a final stage in the year ending in 2018, and upended it. It diverted the Census Bureau's attention. There were 3 major lawsuits filed. Cities, of course, led those lawsuits, California, New York, and then one in Maryland. Full disclosure, I was an expert witness in those 2 cases, so there were 6 cases. And long story short, the cases reached the Supreme Court this past spring, and in June, on the last day of this session, last session, to the surprise of many, the Supreme Court said that the administration had not followed the procedures that are needed to add a question to the form, and they kicked it back down to the lower courts, but there was no time left to go back through that process. The census forms were on their way to the printer. So there is no citizenship question, and I think the mayor can speak more directly to this. I think that the damage that chaos and controversy caused has been done.
That's exactly where I want to go. I feel like our courts have said their final word on this issue, but the final word hasn't been said among the public if there still is this residual echoing fear and distrust between the people to be counted and the government that is doing the counting, that there's this fear among many, whether their immigration status is legal or not legal, this fear that they don't want to give up too much information to a government in which they have no trust. So what are you seeing on the ground in terms of the fear of people in Rhode Island, Providence specifically?
Yeah, before I get to that specific point, and if there was one pleasant surprise going through the process was that, yes, the issue has been politicized, but at the local level, when you're working with the federal government, it's with career civil servants, and they're well-meaning, they want to do the right thing. It hasn't been politicized at that level. And so we definitely have good, strong federal partners in this, and that's really important to remember as you go through this process. And remember that we can't do it alone. We need our community partners. We need the ground up as well. So there are a lot of resources that we can marshal to get this right. But yes, I mean, in spite of how difficult it already is to get a complete count, now we have this additional hurdle. And I think the answer to that, it's a social challenge in that people are scared and concerned, and we can't make the mistake of thinking that there's a technical solution to a social problem. There's a social solution to that social problem. And that's why it's so important to leverage every bit of goodwill and strong relationships that you've built up in the community, because folks are still scared, they're still concerned, and they will continue to hear word of mouth that, oh yes, watch out for the census, citizenship question, Donald Trump, et cetera. And so for every one of those messages that they receive, they need to be bombarded with 10 and 20 messages of, it's important to get this done, there's a firewall, Trump will never get access to this information. You know, if there's one takeaway that I ask everyone to walk away from is that it's not about us repeating it, it's about us repeating it in a way that others will as well, people that are closer to the folks that are living in fear, and having them be the voice that then carries it to the final destination.
If I could just add, I mean, the mayor's absolutely right. It is, you know, the census is planned and carried out by the federal government. It is a federal constitutional responsibility, but it's carried out neighborhood by neighborhood across the country in cities. And that brings up the other challenge we didn't mention quickly, which is the low unemployment rate. The Census Bureau has had and will continue to have trouble recruiting enough local people who, you want people knocking on doors who know the neighborhoods and who can, who have a sense of trust with those communities. And that's going to be a challenge as well. So I think mayors can help get the word out about these job opportunities.
I actually hadn't even thought about that because, right, the last census took place when the unemployment rate nationally was, what, over 9%, touching 10%, and now it's happening in an environment with the lowest unemployment rate in 50 or 60 years. So a very different labor market in which you're hiring these extremely important community leaders to do the door-to-door service in case people don't answer the initial census mailing. You brought up earlier, Terry, and the fact that you're really interested in the intersection between the census and climate change. And we're talking today as California is dealing with a raft of fires in Los Angeles and Sonoma County. You mentioned also that there are natural disasters we might think of being older or totally in the past, like Hurricane Harvey in Houston, that are still facing recovery. I think a lot of people, even if they're familiar with the census, might not be familiar with the degree to which the census is critical for emergency services at a state-to-state level. Tell us a little bit about that intersection between the climate change and census that you're looking at, not just in 2020, but this is an issue that we're going to face every single decade going forward, it seems.
Yeah, so very quickly, I mean, I think there's, I've been trying to raise a red flag about natural disasters in the census for a while, because when there is a natural disaster, and I think they are more frequent now and more disruptive, which is why I'm calling it the census meets climate change, the Census Bureau has to modify its counting procedures. It counts households, right? It goes to homes. And when entire towns are wiped out, but just even communities like Houston, where there are neighborhoods that have not been rebuilt from Hurricane Harvey 2 years ago, now they've been hit again by Tropical Storm Imelda. There are tornadoes, Alabama, Dayton, Ohio. All of these will disrupt the counting process. And so it will be incumbent on mayors, on other local officials to help make sure that the Census Bureau knows where the problem areas are, insist that the Census Bureau modify its procedures, and then make sure that people who have been displaced, and there are many, they can't be counted where they intend to return. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, but they have to be counted somewhere. And it'll be incumbent on local officials to help make sure that happens.
Yeah. All right, well, we've talked about fear and we've talked about climate change, we've talked about homelessness. I do want to end on a moment of optimism, Mayor. I feel like you have communicated both to me privately and on this stage an optimism about your own city's capacity to do the 2020 election and get a complete count. Give us a rah-rah message for the other mayors in this room so that we can all have a successful 2020 count.
So with so many divisive forces in the world, it's important for us to be, that force that brings people together. And there's something special about the census. It happens every 10 years. It dates back to our nation's founding. We can rally people around this cause. So that in and of itself fills me with optimism. But we have also had good results in the initial test phase that we ran in Providence. So there's a way to get it done. We can be successful. Community is always looking for some way to contribute and chip in. People always want to feel as though they're part of something bigger than themselves. And I would see this as an opportunity rather than simply focusing on all of the challenges. And to underscore Terry's last point, the census touches everything that we care about, right? This is Bloomberg, so we have to mention data, and we need accurate data to move the needle to improve the lives of all of our residents, and the census is the foundation of all of that. So this is a massive challenge, but more than anything, it's an opportunity for our communities.
Fantastic. Thank you all, and thanks especially to both of you.
The United States has a problem with maternal mortality, and it is one that has been getting worse.
In the past 25 years, pregnancy-related deaths have more than doubled in the United States. The U.S. has the worst maternal mortality rate in the developed world. Every year, approximately 700 women die of complications related to pregnancy and childbirth, and more than 50,000 pregnant women experience life-threatening complications. African Americans are significantly at risk. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes compared to white women. Now, city leaders and experts around the country are working to bridge the maternal health divide.
On Healing the Divide in Maternal Health, welcome Stacy Stewart, the president and CEO of March of Dimes, and the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser. To lead the conversation, welcome journalist Susan Salney.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here for this truly urgent and frankly heartbreaking discussion. We're fortunate to have with us 2 leaders who've been working to tackle this crisis head on. As you just saw in the video, the number of women dying from pregnancy-related causes has doubled over the last 25 years, making the United States the most dangerous place to give birth in the developed world. Mayor Bowser, Stacy, let's start with this big picture. Why are we moving backward as a nation on this issue?
Well, I think it's startling, and most people aren't familiar with those numbers. And I think it took very high-profile women having the courage to come out and talk about their birth experiences that caught a lot of people's attention. The truth is, those numbers have been trending in that way for many years. So what we know is that it's going to take the resources, the attention, of all of us in cities and the federal government to make some progress in this effort. And we, for one, in our city have set the goal and are putting all of our resources and intentions behind driving down maternal mortality and infant death in our city.
Stacey, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the video really pinpointed some really important statistics, and I think this has been an issue in this country for many, many years. Over the past, couple decades, every wealthy nation in the country, in the world, has seen a reduction in maternal mortality. We've seen an increase. And I think part of the issue is that we have had a lot of systemic challenges in this country for a long time. We've had racial inequity for a long, long time, going back generations. Some of us are just waking up to some of these facts, but some of us have been living this reality for a very long time.
Well, what are other countries doing right that we're doing wrong? A woman is more likely to die here than in Canada, in the UK.
Right. Well, a lot of countries have universal health care to start. So let's just start with that. I think when you deny people health care and the ability to pay for it, you're automatically going to leave people behind, and people are not going to have the best outcomes. And that affects even the most vulnerable, including our children and our babies, right? In addition to women. But I think there's some other things. There are other policies that create a more supportive environment for women to have babies healthier and for them to be healthier. Expanded leave policies, for example. Gender pay equity issues are more prominent in other countries. In European countries, we've seen a lot of success on some of these issues, but frankly, those countries don't have nearly the diversity that we enjoy here in the United States. And I think the United States has to confront the fact that we have not dealt with the issue of race in this country in the way that it needs to be dealt with. We know that the issue of poor health outcomes for moms and babies is not about race, but about racism. And until we address that fact and acknowledge that and openly talk about that, it'll be more difficult for us to address some of the challenges that we face.
Well, let's dig a little deeper on the racial disparities, because if you look at national or local statistics, what jumps out is that Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than their white counterparts. That Black infant mortality is twice the rate for white babies. So directly, what role does racism play in all of this in society and in the healthcare system?
Well, we really wanted to dig deep into this question in our city, and a couple of years ago, I launched a national maternal and infant health conference right here in Washington, D.C. We host it during the Black Caucus Conference that happens in Washington, D.C. Every single year to bring together federal lawmakers, mayors from across the nation to talk about these issues. In our city, for example, access to insurance and health care is not the issue. Over 95% of Washingtonians have insurance. So people of all incomes can go to primary care, specialized care, hospital care. And so we wanted to know what it's going to take for all of our citizens to be taking advantage of the best health care possible. And when they do, are they heard? Are they listened to? And is everything being done possible to have them have healthy outcomes? So part of our strategy is to make sure that we're talking to our residents pre-conception, talking to them about do they plan to have babies? Are they connected to a primary care provider? Do they need specialized care? We're also focused in that campaign, we call it our Well Women campaign, making sure they are having that relationship. What we find is that all of our residents don't feel respected in those interactions, and that's why it's a lot of the work that Stacey is doing around educating providers around the country about the biases that they may bring into their care is so important to saying it's not enough to say, do we have insurance, but do people feel heard and respected when they go to see their doctors?
Stacey, you're talking about implicit bias in the healthcare system?
Exactly. I mean, on the maternal, the mayor's exactly right. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of why we're seeing high rates of maternal mortality in this country have to do a lot with misdiagnoses, delayed diagnoses, about not having consistent care for all women, especially women of color. So, and when we look deeper at that, we can see, and there are plenty of studies that show that women, Black women especially, often talk about the fact that they do not feel respected and heard by the healthcare system. And it's not just doctors and nurses. It often is the front desk receptionists. When they show up at the clinic, someone doesn't make eye contact with them, doesn't recognize them as a whole being in front of them, right? And the word of mouth spreads, and then they choose not to go back to seek care from that clinic or that provider. So one of the things that we're doing at the March of Dimes is, in addition to many other things, is launching implicit bias training. Now, the one great thing about this is that some of the federal legislation addressing maternal mortality really does require this, and we do encourage Congress to pass this legislation. California just recently passed state legislation requiring all healthcare providers to go through implicit bias training. We all have implicit biases, all of us. But to the extent that implicit bias actually hinders or inhibits the ability for that healthcare provider to provide high quality, consistent care to any woman, irrespective of her race, ethnicity, her language, whatever it is, then we have to address that and really do some things to counter that.
In terms of national data collection, wouldn't a standardized system across all the states be a good place to start in terms of getting accurate numbers and then being able to evaluate and investigate the cases so we can get to the causes?
Well, I know the mayor can talk about this a lot because of the work she's doing. We were really proud to be a part of passing legislation at the end of last year, the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act, which actually supported all states setting up what we call maternal mortality review committees. So part of the issue of this is that we were not even respecting the issue enough to collect data on it, right? We weren't even looking at collecting consistent data across all states at the same time in the same way to provide more transparency to the issue. That legislation now provides for each state to have a maternal mortality review committee, and so that we can collect better data and design better interventions. We should have been doing this a long time ago, but it's good that we're now getting to it right now.
And we launched our committee earlier this year. And our local legislation requires that we're collecting all kinds of information related to maternal death, including other factors that we may find in the investigation of a mom's death that may have led to her death that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. So all of that information is going to help us build a government that supports women and families. We have, for example, another commission in the district called Thrive by 5, and we have a director. This came out of our first Infant and Maternal Health Summit, a director of our Thrive by 5 coalition that is really responsible for looking across all of our agencies and helping me identify budget priorities and making sure that we're funding the initiatives that our Department of Health has deemed effective. And one of those is making sure that we are funding local organizations. Part of the data suggests to us that the closer we can get to the grassroots in supporting women, the more likely they are to trust those providers. So if we can get funding out to Mary Center, a well-respected organization in our community, for example, Community Hope, in community, so people aren't traveling long distances and they're more likely to know the providers, we know that we can provide more supportive environments for them during their pregnancy.
Now, you're dealing with the maternal mortality rate here that's twice the national average. I know some of your efforts are on the new side, but are you seeing progress and do you feel hopeful?
I do feel hopeful, and we look at, of course, we've looked at the data over a 10-year period prior to launching our health summit, and we were startled by it. For a city that has we're the second most insured jurisdiction in the United States of America, only just following Massachusetts, and that's been the case for more than 5 years, and actually before the Affordable Care Act. So the amount of investment that we put into healthy outcomes for DC residents, we know that we should have better numbers. Now, there are things that the government can't control. We know that we have our residents who carry with them generations of stress, anxiety, and all of those things they take into a pregnancy. So putting that to the side, because we can't control for that generational anxiety and stress that women bring into a pregnancy, but all of the things that we can control, we are getting women connected to their primary care providers so that they're well women going into pregnancies, helping connect people to prenatal services, and post-pregnancy is also important. We know that we're watching mothers and infants for that entire first year. So being able to fund visits into homes and follow-ups to doctors is key to making sure that first year is successful for them.
Exactly. I'd just like to remind the audience that we'll be coming for your questions in just a moment, so you can have them ready. Stacey, are there any other cities with especially high numbers of mothers and babies dying? And also, are there any good models for other cities to follow?
Yeah, well, first, I would say one of the best models is right here in the District of Columbia. And Mayor Bowser, and I've told her this, and I will keep telling her this, that she's, I think, providing some of the best leadership among all mayors on this issue. The summit that she's just had, like 1,000 people came, not only building awareness, but getting information out to people so that her constituents and the residents of the District of Columbia really are empowered with information. I think one of the big missing pieces in this is that sometimes we can often feel victimized by this, by what we hear on the news and the discussion, but I think it's really important to understand that we all can take ownership of our own health. And that won't solve the issue completely. We do need to deal with the systemic failures that are affecting our health, but I do think it's incumbent upon all of us to understand that there are things within our power that we can do, and I think what she's doing in her leadership is really providing that. I will also say, too, one of the other things that we're doing in the District of Columbia is launching what we call supportive pregnancy care, which is a form of group prenatal care, which has been shown to have the results of reducing preterm birth, premature birth, by anywhere from even 30% up to 70% in some cases. And it's especially effective for women of color. These are just women who come together in a supportive environment, who are pregnant and who can support each other during their pregnancy. And what we know is that it absolutely helps to reduce the stress and anxiety that often can influence and affect and cause even poor health outcomes for women as well as for babies. In DC, there are some great examples of some great work that's being done. We're working across the country, and there are great cities like Boston and Houston and other cities that are really tackling this issue. One of the big examples that we're tracking very carefully is in LA, where there's an AIM initiative that is really looking to reduce racial disparities in birth outcomes, really especially looking at the racial disparity among babies in the issue of infant mortality. It's a newly launched effort, but what I would say is that, and I think this is the most important thing, is that just like here in DC, there's no one sector, there's no one entity alone that can solve this. What we know about premature birth and maternal mortality is that it has to do not only with what happens in the clinician's office, in the doctor's office, but it has very much to do with how women live. You know, access to transportation, access to health care, housing, and all of the kinds of factors that affect a woman's life can both influence her life and the life of her baby. So it requires a very and collaborative effort, cross-sector effort to really bring all the right sectors together between employers, local and state government, nonprofit organizations, healthcare providers, and a whole group of different entities that can come together and combine strategies so that more success can be made and there can be more supportive activities to lead to better results.
And we know that babies born prematurely suffer. What's behind the rise in the number of preterm births the state is seeing?
Well, what we say at the March of Dimes is we don't really just have one crisis, we have two, right? We have a maternal health crisis, we have an infant health crisis. And the fact of the matter is that we've got to address women's health before women are pregnant. And I think that what a lot of us have been doing for many years is focusing on the woman while she's pregnant, but often that's too late to turn the tide in a very substantial way. It's not to say that we don't need to be providing excellent health care to women, that women don't need to be receiving and have access to high quality, affordable prenatal care. But what we are seeing is that a lot of the issues that lead to maternal death and maternal morbidity have everything to do with how a woman's health, what it looks like even before she's pregnant. Often the issues that she experiences in terms of her own health impact the baby's health. And so it just naturally flows that if a woman's health and a mom's health while she's pregnant is declining, that's going to impact the baby. In fact, what we're seeing is while we're seeing a doubling of maternal mortality rates over the past 25 years, this is now the 4th year of an increase in preterm birth rates. And prematurity and the consequences of prematurity are the leading causes of death for children between the ages of 0 and 5, which is often very shocking for people. And what we know is that a black woman is up to 50% more likely to have a baby prematurely. So just like we have issues on the maternal health side, we have issues on the infant health side, and there are times when we have to think about a woman as a woman, independent of the baby, and there are times we have to think about the two of them together as a unit.
Well, let's talk about access to care for a moment. More than 5 million women across 1,000 counties live in areas that March of Dimes calls maternity deserts. And even a city as populous as Washington has certain zones that are considered maternity care deserts. Can you explain these and talk about their impact on health?
Well, let me start by saying we're very focused in our city. We are a city, you probably, many people in this room have heard me talk about the fact that we have 8 wards in our city. We have 2 wards separated from the 6 wards by a river. And we're very focused on how to have more access for all DC residents. So we don't want geography to be an issue for them. And we're focused right now in our city on a whole health care system transformation to get more hospital beds closer to people who need them. But even more important than hospital beds is a system of care that supports people so they don't have to be in the hospital. And we are especially concerned about specialty OBGYN care closer to the people who need it. So everything that the government can do, not only to invest in a new hospital, but to encourage providers to practice closer to residents who need it, and geographies that are separated by a river is part of our focus with our healthcare transformation effort.
Are midwives and doulas good alternatives for people who don't have immediate access to hospitals?
I think so. I mean, part of this issue of the maternal care deserts and the study that we did, we looked at these 35% of all counties in the country lack a hospital that offers obstetric services, lack even one OBGYN, and lack a certified nurse midwife. 35% of all counties. It affects about 5 million women. About 10 million women live in limited care deserts. And so it affects a lot of women. It affects a lot of babies that are born. About 4/5 of all the counties that are considered maternal care deserts are in rural areas. But about 1/5 of them are in urban areas. And in Ward 7 and 8, we would consider here in the District of Columbia having a limited care, maternal care desert, I would say. And that's where we would say that absolutely, looking at alternative forms, as the mayor mentioned, of care, a system of care is really important. Doulas and midwives, historically and generationally, have always been relied on by women, especially women of color. There was a time in this country where that was the primary way that women gave birth. We've gotten away from that. We've created a very hospitalized environment, and in many cases that has proven to be very effective. But in many cases, it is good to have alternative forms of prenatal care, other ways that women feel are more culturally competent ways of having their baby and delivering their baby. And we also believe that those kinds of forms of care need to be covered by Medicaid as well. Medicaid covers 43% of all births in this country. Medicaid is a primary payer of pregnancy and childbirth in this country. And we've got to make sure that if women want to have access to other forms of care that they feel meets their needs and is more attuned to their needs, we have to make sure that our system of care provides for the affordable option for those women as well.
All right. Well, let's turn to the audience for a moment and see if there are any questions. Okay, we have one right here. Hi.
Morning. Julia Richmond, Chief Innovation and Technology Officer, City of Boulder. I wonder if any work has been done evaluating places where there's higher levels of access to family planning and reproductive rights and the correlation between maternal health.
Another question.
I don't know that I have that study offhand. What we do know is that access to quality, high-quality family planning is extremely important to make sure that a woman is able to manage her own health. And what we also know is care, conception, intraconception care between pregnancies is also very important. What we know is that birth spacing and spacing the birth can actually reduce the risk of a preterm birth after the first birth or a subsequent birth after one pregnancy. So when we limit those options for women, we know that we are likely to see poor health outcomes for a mom and a baby. So we haven't looked at the exact correlation of it, but we know that there absolutely is a connection for sure.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question. Yes.
Hi, Kathy Sheehan. I'm the mayor of the city of Albany. And health services in our community are at the county level. And I'm interested, you talked about women feeling disrespected when they go to their practitioner, but we have a huge underutilization of the services that are available by healthcare workers who work for the county. And the commissioner of the county health department says that, a lot of it is that I think there's fear, right? There's fear that if you let this person into your house and it's not clean enough, or there is something going on, or historically there's this fear of having these services come into the home and into the community. Have you worked on, you talk about implicit biases, but breaking that down so that those early services that are available, to me it's shameful that they're underutilized. We have empty seats for safe and healthy families, and part of it is just this divide between the nurse practitioners, the providers that are going out, and the community's trust of those individuals.
I wouldn't agree with you more. We have some of our services that are underutilized, especially women vet visits to primary care doctors, I would say is the biggest category of underutilization. And then we have some of our services, Mayor, that are overutilized, and some other mayors are gonna know what I mean. Calls to 911. Emergency room visits. And we know for a fact that type of care won't lead to the types of outcomes we want for women and babies. So our focus has to be how we are connecting and listening to our residents and meeting them exactly where they are. I'm reminded of a trip you asked about cities around the world that we took to Cuba. Cuba has one of the best experiences with healthy moms and healthy deliveries in the world. And one of the things, the outtakes I have from that, is that doctors are in the communities where people live, literally. And the distance between the doctor and the patient is much smaller. And our country is much bigger. And so how do we take that literal geographic small space between patient and doctor into a setting, whether it is in the doctor's office or some other way that we bring clinicians into communities. So that distance, that fear, the information asymmetry, if you will, is shortened in interactions with our residents and our health professionals. So I don't know exactly all of the ways and all of the things that we have to do to shorten that space, but I know for sure that's what it is. Our people are voting with their feet. Instead of going to a provider in their community, when it's more convenient, when it's less wait time, all of those things, they're choosing instead to call an ambulance and go sit in an emergency room. So we know that there are things that we have to do to change that experience for our residents.
Mayor Stacy, I thank you for your expertise on this issue. And thank you all very much, too.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here this morning. Today's breakout sessions begin at 11 o'clock, followed by lunch. We're back here with the concluding plenary session at 12:30, with the program starting promptly at 1 o'clock. See you then.